We are now engaging in a discussion on the spaces of free speech. As an architect, I'm particularly interested, of course, in spaces, and it's been a useful, or at least interesting, way for me to think about the transformations we've seen last year, to think about the ways in which modes of practices of different spaces come together on the campus. Sometimes we make agreements and norms and practices in one realm that come into another unexpectedly and violently, and this is certainly the case when it comes to the way in which online discourse has transformed and shaped real-life discourse here on the campus. In this conversation, it's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Hayward, Senior Resident Scholar at the Institute of Governmental Studies, Deirdre Milligan, an Associate Professor in the School of Information, Kina Hazelwood-Carter, who... They're downstairs? Okay, they're coming up, and Jillian Free. Kina Hazelwood-Carter is a doctoral student in psychology and the president of the Graduate Assembly. Jillian Free is a student advocate at the ASUC. But what I'm going to invite each of our speakers to do is, as with the previous panels, speak for a few minutes. We're going to then have a brief conversation with each other and then invite comments and questions from the room.
The description of, I mean, I appreciate the complexity and difficulty of having a day-long event on the subject in the communications and architectural school that tries to disaggregate these things into pieces, which is what a university ought to do. Having said that, I found the description of this panel especially challenging. So I think I'm going to try and do something workable and hopefully helpful by looking at the second sentence, which is about the spaces of free speech, architectural, digital, and institutional. So let's start with digital. I mean, lots been said about this already. If I were the proverbial emperor for a day, I think I would ban social media on campus, because I think it's not a novel insight to say that a lot of social media these days is really anti-social media, right? I mean, you can't really do that, obviously, although it would be nice to say, why don't we limit Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all these other things to just celebrating what a great time we had at Cabo on spring break, and wasn't it great the Bears won last weekend, and really rad party over the weekend. Instead, of course, what happens is I'm actually playing around with my own social media version of Einstein's famous equation I call SE, which means speed of a thermonuclear argument equals m, the magnitude of the issue involved, c squared, the speed of social media these days, and the probability of almost any argument on a hot button subject reaching thermonuclear proportions. It approaches 1 these days almost in seconds. This is not a novel insight, but I'm old enough to remember the old days, actually as a journalist right out of college before I went to graduate school. Those days we used these old things called typewriters, and if you remember the news cycle in those days, it was much slower and more, I guess I'll even use an archaic word, genteel, and the style of argument, often very vigorous, however, happened at a slower pace, and so the ratio of thought to heat was better than it is today, I think. So, for example, back in the early 80s, and then I went to graduate school, worked in Washington think tanks. The way the world worked is some think tank would put out a study at the National Press Club at 9:30 in the morning, and it might be on, I'll just say rent control, not some super hot button issue, but a controversial one among economists. And then the economists would speak, and all day long the print writers would write about it. And then maybe at 7 o'clock there might be one of those old-fashioned long-form panel discussions on it on the news hour on PBS. That was always very sober. Then 3 or 4 days later would be the first letters to the editor in the paper saying, this study's completely wrong, or it's right. And then 3-4 weeks later, an opposing point of view at, say, the Brookings Institution would put out a rebuttal study. Took a while. You had to look things up, in like stacks in the library, statistics. I did a lot of work on environmental statistics, and when I started doing that almost 30 years ago, I had to go to the EPA Region 9 library and look up data, in printed books, printed reports from EPA. Of course, now everything's online, and so what happens today? You put out, somebody says something, somebody puts out a study, a report, or an article, And this plays out in practically 15 minutes. You know, the 24-hour news stations have people on for these 6-minute segments where they yell at each other. They do less of that. I mean, both Fox and MSNBC 20 years ago used to sort of have left and right on their segments. They quit doing that and segmented in ways that were described. And, you know, by the evening, it's old news, right? And I'll just one more observation of this as a political scientist. It's interesting to note that you know, in those days, I mean, I went back to Washington during the Reagan era, and in those days, the way that it worked is there'd be a story in the paper in the morning, usually some leak, some scandal, some problem, some issue. And you'd spend all day at the White House thinking about, okay, how do we handle this? What's going to be reported on the evening news? What's our message we're going to put out in the afternoon? And what's going to be the headline in the paper tomorrow? Well, today, that's all compressed in the first 15 minutes. Of course, today, I mean, I know people who work in the Trump White House, first thing they do when they wake up in the morning is pick up their phone and say, what did the boss tweet at 3 a.m. that's going to make my life miserable this morning? That's how it works now, right? So it's a completely changed world, and I think everybody knows that this rapidity of the social world and the 24-hour news cycle and the great leveling effect that Professor Wright spoke this morning of, you know, anybody can be a pundit now. I'm always amazed. I get on Twitter and I see someone with 100,000 followers I've never heard of. And their only claim to fame is they've accumulated 100,000 followers by tweeting 125 times a day. So, you know, it's a great equalizer, but I think people understand it hasn't really improved the national conversation very well. In fact, I think it's generally agreed by everybody. It has contributed to the deepening polarization that we witness in the country. Now, transfer that onto a college campus. As was said this morning, a lot of students I talked to, more so at smaller colleges than here, and some reasons for that we could talk about, say they don't like to speak up in class because they're afraid not just of doxing, of abusing personal information, but somebody said something really awful in class. And I think there starts to move us toward the conversation around safe spaces, as they're called. Now, already that subject, first of all, that term has become a subject of mockery and ridicule off campus. Second, already this subject has, I think, fallen into familiar ruts. So I'll see if I can't try and do something a little different with it by then picking up architecture as your other totem for this. My mind actually ran back to the speech Winston Churchill gave after the House of Commons was bombed in 1940 and mostly destroyed. And people say, if you've never read it in architecture, it's a really great little speech about architecture. Because people said, well, that's a shame, but why don't we build a modern representative chamber that's semicircular and so forth? Oh dear, I'm running out of time fast. And he said, no, build it exactly the way it was, not for any traditional antiquarianism, but because the central line of the speech was, first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. Do you know that speech?
Should we shape our spaces?
Shape our spaces, okay.
Yes.
Did he say, maybe he did say, whatever, but the
Yeah,
same thought, right? And, I've given a lot of thought over the years about the kind of classrooms I like. And I'm right about this, I think, because I had a controlled experiment a couple of years ago when I did a series of 4 lectures in Washington, D.C. for about 60 students in 4 different locations. My favorite has always been, if it's a large lecture class, this was about 70 students, was the semicircular amphitheater style where everybody's and everybody can see everybody else. And I can stand right in the middle in a certain way, closer to everybody than you can in a room like this. And I don't like the theater-style lecture hall very much. And what I observed of those students was, in fact, when they could see each other, the discussion was better. This is why seminars are the best of all. My favorite classroom is 20 people around a hollow square. Not many of those at Berklee, but some. And then much less discussion. I think in big lecture halls here at Berklee, people are less inclined to talk, just in general, not even before you get to controversies. I mean, I deal in my classes with a lot of very controversial and delicate matters, and only once at Georgetown did I have a class blow up. It's very unfortunate. I learned a lot from that. You have to be careful about how you do that, but I think it's important and necessary to do. So that leads to my final point, which was institutional. Look, I think for all the problems that are raised by free speech, hate speech, safe spaces, whether you want to use the term protected classes or vulnerable populations, all very reasonable. I have to say that, I should have said in response to what was said this morning, I intensely dislike the phrase snowflakes about students who are said to be sensitive to hate speech or whatever, however you want to characterize it. I think that's a real slur on students, and I don't use it, I don't like it. I don't care much for safe spaces, but universities ought to be the best institutions for dealing with these problems, because unlike the Twitter sphere and the cable news channels with 6-minute segments. What we have here is time. Time in the classroom to talk through these things in a serious way and to engage in disagreements in a serious way rather than a frivolous way. And so, I don't know, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd do two things, ban the internet, but also have semicircular classrooms where people can see each other. And I actually think that form would make a difference. Too late now, but who said we had to be reasonable and realistic?
That's a great point. Thank you, Stephen. Deirdre, can I invite you to go next?
I actually thought it would be nice to have the students.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. Kina, would you like to go next? Kenna, sorry.
No worries. Sure, and kind of picking up your point around classrooms and what sort of spaces they're fostered. I was fortunate enough to go to Bard College, which has a student-teacher ratio of like 1 to 8. My largest class was my choir class, and that was 25. And by the time you get into upper divisions, you're at 3-4 people in a room. And what was really wonderful about that is they started us off with 3 weeks of a series that they called Learning and Thinking. And in Learning and Thinking, it's only the first years. You have to come 3 weeks before anybody else shows up to campus, and you're given a reading list. And in that reading list, you're asked to engage critically with a lot of content that you might not necessarily want to engage with on your own. And then you're taught over the course of the next 3 weeks with 15 other people in a room how to talk to each other, how to disagree, how to use text to interrogate not only your own point, but somebody else's. And what was so wonderful about that is it really set us up to move the rest of our time at college in a way that really allowed for discourse, that really allowed for people to begin to understand that you can have cognitive dissonance. Right? I can believe something and disagree with it in part all at the same time. And other people can do the same thing. And I'm not saying that Bard was perfect, because it was far from that. But it was something that when I've come to Berklee now to pursue my doctorate, I've seen the difference in the sorts of conversations I'm having here. And oftentimes what's beginning to happen is people immediately go to this kind of nuclear option, which is to throw out a slur, throw out a term that they know will silence the other. And that's really problematic to me. We must find ways of talking to each other. But we also have to respect these safe spaces. And the reason that we have to respect these safe spaces and the need for them and what it is that they actually represent is that we come from backgrounds that inform what we think the world means, right? There's this consensus effect. What I think is important, what I believe is what I then project onto the rest of the world. That's not true. 75% of white people have no Black friends. So when I bring up issues of what it means to be a Black person in the world, when I bring up issues of what it means to be married to a Black man in this world, I often get people who say, but that can't be true. But that's not right. But they don't know. That's not part of their lived experience. They think that I live the same life that they do. And so when we look at this and we talk about safe spaces, it's much easier for them to get to a safe space. They aren't challenged. They're surrounded by the same people with the same ideas. One of the worst bubbles is Northern California, and I say that as a San Francisco native, right? I grew up in Pacific Heights, talk about a bubble. And so when we look at this, we have to respect that sometimes people need to separate so they can come back to a space where they can be okay, where they don't have to constantly worry about somebody saying something, regardless if it's well-intentioned, right? That's the issue. Well, I didn't mean it that way. Well, you didn't understand what I was trying to say. No, but I did. You didn't think about what it meant for me to hear it in a different skin. And so when we talk about these spaces and we talk about what it means here on campus, I think we really have to look at what are we choosing to say to each other? What are our actions actually causing in terms of the impact? Because we have to care about that as a community. Professor Michael Cohen used to start one of his classes trolling for any sort of racial slur that he himself would not like to hear as a self-described privileged white man. And he worked for cycles and cycles and cycles, trying to find a term that he wouldn't want to be called. And he finally got one. Douchebag. If you're from a marginalized population, I guarantee you don't have to go over cycles and cycles of crowdsourcing to get to a term that would be one that you would find offensive. That would be one that would be challenged, that would actually cut you to your very quick in some cases because of this power differential that we have. And so in this space, on this campus, when we talk about safe spaces, we have to take that into consideration as well. We all hold very amounts of power, and I understand that this idea of privilege, white privilege in particular, is one that's challenging for people to engage with. Because what it requires that you do is to acknowledge that not only are you maybe not as good as you think you are, meritocracy might not actually be a thing, but also that you are complicit in continuing the structures that disenfranchise others, and that what it is that's happening is in part your fault because you're not challenging it and trying to break it down. So when we talk about digital spaces, it's really easy to sea lion. It's my new favorite phrase, right? A sea lion goes out and it wants fish now, right? It is going to call for it, it's going to annoy you, it's just going to go for it, go for it, go for it, and demand. In these online spaces, people will see a post they don't like and they will immediately go in and challenge it. And then they say, well, if you don't agree with me, why? You have to tell me now why. You have to educate me as to why it is your opinion and your experience is valid. They sea lion. They demand energy and resources from others without actually engaging in the work to begin to educate themselves. I am happy to explain. I am happy to help educate. I have a master's in teaching. I'm doing my PhD in school psychology. That's what my life will be, is educating others. However, you have to take some responsibility as well. You have to come to me saying, I was thinking about this, I was reading about this, I was in this other discussion, and this part was hard for me to get. Would you help me understand it more? Then it's actually helping to balance this power. Then it's actually allowing us to have discourse, because I'm not in a place of sitting as a lecture, right? This is why seminars are so powerful, is we learn from each other, we all contribute. And that's why it's so important for us to recognize that we have to do this as a collective. It cannot rest with one, it cannot rest with one group. We cannot look for those who are ready or taking on the disproportionate burden of the social, emotional, and mental effort to translate in a way that you'll accept as okay. We have to look at this as something where we all are part of the solution. We all create a space that everyone can step into, everyone can feel safe, and everybody knows we're equally invested in creating this together. That 75% is really important to recognize, because you might never have had the conversation about race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, but I guarantee that Black person has had it way more times than you can even begin to imagine. Another way of kind of showing the difference, this particular study that just came out September 14th, I mean, this is literally, I guess, less than a month ago now, said that a white person is 91 times more likely to only be friends with other white people. Meanwhile, Black people are only 10 times more likely to be friends with only other Black people. We have to cross barriers, and we have to make it safe to do so.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So my name is Jillian. I'm a student, an undergraduate. I am an elected ASUC official, the student advocate. And a lot of these conversations have been rooted in hypotheticals or in theories around free speech and what does it mean to think about it and what should or shouldn't be happening. But I'd like to root us in a moment into what the reality of what free speech has been like for students on this campus. So this is our upper Sproul. We have our Sproul Hall, our Campanile on a regular day. So during the days leading up to and the days of Milo's Free Speech Week, this was our campus. That's Bancroft, our student store. So imagine you have a midterm, because a lot of us had midterms. And you're walking to class, and you're rushing, thinking about OChem, and then you see this. Now imagine you're a student of color, or a trans student, or an undocumented student, or particularly a black student, and you see this. This area was blocked off because there was a bomb scare. There was a Target bag in our Amazon store. So while you're walking to class, you might not only be nervous or rightfully afraid because of your campus environment, you might also be wondering why they're there and what could happen. And you might be wondering if this could happen. You might also be thinking about this. This didn't happen, luckily, but this did. Or really, this. So about 800,000 for this particular week or this particular day, hundreds of thousands of dollars, was spent so that speech could be protected and a crowd of 25 could support one speaker. So now I want to talk about what the impact of free speech moving to different spaces is, because that's really what this conversation is about. What happens when the space that you're here to study becomes occupied by police and deeply entangled in the politics of free speech? We've seen a lot of different types of impacts for different types of students that came to this week with very different narratives and discourses that they wanted to have. But some notable ones were in 3 areas: academics, concerns for safety, and your digital presence. Academically, many students chose not to come to campus, not to go to the classes that we're supposed to be having these discussions and discourses in. They chose because maybe they couldn't focus as you're walking to this class, or you hear literally helicopters for days above your head. They might also not have come to campus for safety, which brings me to the second point. There were different reasons for students as to why they felt unsafe. Some students felt unsafe because they were worried about what actions would follow the speech of certain groups on this campus, and reasonably so, because words do lead to actions, and we've seen it before on other campuses. And our administrators and students were preparing for the potential of Charlottesville. Some students also felt unsafe because of police, because some students, particularly those in marginalized communities, have reason to be afraid of police presence and what that entails. Physical safety also is related to digital safety, and this discussion of the digital breaching the physical, particularly around doxing, which might have, I believe, was brought up earlier in this series, but we had 2 students and an administrator doxed. What essentially this means is that your online presence and profile is attacked. You're harassed, you're exposed, and it can lead to dangerous situations. Students have been threatened. Faculty have been threatened because there was a plant in one of the professors' classrooms. And in fact, I also found out that today, a lot of participants, particularly those of color or those afraid of being targeted by certain groups, chose not to participate in this series. So if you notice, most of us are white up here. And I want you to think about why that might be. So I rooted in impact because when you talk about speech, it isn't just in your textbooks. It's not just a theoretical debate. Speech can be free, but it affects people. And I'd also like to say that students here aren't afraid of dialogue and discourse, but they recognize that words lead to actions. And protecting those spaces so that you can leave words at words that are interesting and thought-provoking is separate than what we experienced as a campus these past few weeks. That was not about discourse and dialogue in practice, whether or not the students that participated in organization wanted it in theory. And that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deirdre Milligan. I'm an associate professor at the School of Information, and I studied architecture actually in my undergraduate degree, and like to think about the ways in which the places, the spaces in which we operate influence freedom of expression, privacy, other values that we care about, because we think they're important both for individual self-development, but they're also essential to our flourishing as a democracy. And places clearly shape the kinds of engagements and experiences that people have. Many people this morning touched on this issue, and it was really nice to see the variations on space and both the affordances of the place and our experiences and how they differ based on our own backgrounds and our personal experiences, and how they lead for us to interpret the presence and absence of different sorts of people and objects and affordances of those spaces in different ways. There are variations in legal obligations, of course, and my background is actually in law. But I really want to focus on other ways in which the shifting contours of places in which we express ourselves are shaping our current conversation about free speech. And I want to start by looking back, in part because Ken Goldberg is the person who invited me to come and speak today. Several years ago, I was asked to attend a meeting at California Hall, which is the first time that Professor Goldberg and I met. He's both a leading researcher and an artist, and he mixes technical advances with art practice to prompt critical reflections on society and its values. And I think you're going to see some demonstration of that later today. So Professor Goldberg and his students had installed an art research project, which was called Demonstrate, and it was comprised of some advanced networked robotic cameras and a website that allowed anyone anywhere in the world to control a camera, zoom in, pan across Sproul Plaza to explore it. And you could snap pictures and they would be posted to a website, and you could annotate them, and it was designed as a vehicle for prompting discussion and debate. And this project was installed, in fact, to commemorate the 4th anniversary of the free speech movement, and the hope was to enable folks who couldn't be present, who perhaps were not aware of the importance of freedom of expression or the extent to which students on this campus engaged with the administration to ensure that this was a site for robust expression. Those who couldn't be present could learn about the free speech movement, could participate in discussions online, and also to reflect on the changing nature of public spaces and places as they were being networked, and as video technology, a lot of work, Ken's work has been on visual processing algorithms, was altering the way in which we could record and analyze and understand and identify things in spaces. So the camera that was installed very high up on the Student Union building could zoom in close enough to read messages being tapped into a phone. It could position itself to get a bird's eye view of a student reclining, and it could capture images of people in the dark, right? And so anyone in the world could log on and watch these activities, yet remain hidden. They could look over your shoulder, they could look down at your prone sunbathing body, all without your knowledge. And this was a research project, right? And this is something that it was done in a way to promote discussion and deliberation about public place and privacy. And in today's environment where every one of you, I'm sure, is carrying a video camera in your pocket that can immediately upload still and video images and audio to multiple platforms on which you circulate information, for potentially worldwide distribution, this probably sounds really mundane, right? So you're like, so why were you in California Hall? Well, I was in California Hall because Sproul Place is this, Sproul Plaza is this place that represents the university's commitment to nourishing robust expression and eloquent listening, I like that term, in both words and expressive acts. And it attests to our community's values. It gives them material form. It provides literally the infrastructure to bring our theoretical and ethical commitments into practice. Yet despite all of this publicness, right, it's a site for public speech and expressive acts, it's a site for public gathering, campus rightly realized that the introduction of the camera might change the nature of that place in ways that merited thoughtful consideration. So Professor Goldberg and I and some of my students and folks in California Hall agreed to explore this particular project and think about whether or not there might be some modifications or changes that both might make the presence of the camera more evident to people in the place so they could understand how they might want to moderate their behavior, and also deal with some of the potential risks of allowing anybody to zoom in on people on campus. So I think the conversations we're having today about freedom of expression are related to the ways in which technology and networking alter physical public places, such as Sproul Plaza. And I think they also relate to the way in which our expectations about the relationship between freedom of expression and equality are being shaped by the affordances and policies of the privately owned online public places that play an increasingly important role in social and political discourse. How so? First, Sproul Plaza and campuses generally are being used as both places for debate and discussion, but also as stages for these elaborate performances of speech, right? And they're being used in that way to challenge our institutional identity and to challenge the values that we so go to such great lengths to protect. And this is just, it's incredibly difficult to have your campus changed into a circus or a theater. And it is technology that is allowing Sproul Plaza to become that performative stage. Second, the ability to capture and distribute performances of speech and interactions between speakers has turned ephemeral activity into records that can be distributed in ways that powerfully advance speech and equality, right? So all of us, I think, have seen the powerful way in which video can capture police brutality, homicide, right? Things that we are very happy that we become aware of. But it can also allow revision, repurposing, and decontextualizations that support sensationalism and polarization, rather than debate, disagreement, and constructive engagement. Third, the ability to take these images and then identify individuals that are in them, right? To not be present, but to later on go through and comb through and identify individuals is the reason that we see, I think in many ways, this concern about participation, right? That people are being doxxed, people are being threatened, not necessarily by those who are in the physical space with them, but after the fact, because those images become available and people are identified and people are able to kind of draw trails back to their homes or their online identities and terrorize them. So the experiences that the way in which technology is altering our experiences of these places is very much tied up to the conversations we're having about our ability and commitment to support freedom of expression in them. Finally, I just want to say that many of us spend our time on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and other platforms that support robust discussion, but also have guidelines and policies in terms of service and algorithms that moderate and limit expression in ways that the university cannot. And I think there's this disconnect where people are saying, well, we can clean things up over here, we can do these different things, I can block, I don't have to hear you, I can defriend you, I can send you into a great black hole. Why can't we do this in physical space? And it's because the affordances, the law, and our commitments are different. Thank you.
Okay, it's my usual practice of moments like this to ask if you guys have any questions for each other on the and maybe let you sit with that for a minute. I think you may actually be right on the Churchill quote, but I would make the distinction in some ways. I think the most interesting distinction is we use these two words to describe locations like this one where we come together. We use the word space, which we often use to describe things like the presence of four walls and a roof, and we use the word place to describe something that has a kind of social or political significance. And so this difference between spaces and places it speaks a lot to the distinction between somewhere that is simply outlined and in which certain structures exist, and someplace that we actually craft together. And so maybe I would invite you guys to reflect a little bit on whether that distinction between space and place, or what the social definition of space and the physical definition of space and place might allow us to have a more fruitful discussion about the kinds of spaces that we need to create, and what the future of a space like Sproul Plaza should be, that is used more often now for symbolic operations than it is for the actual function which we with which we would seek traditionally to invest it, of the campus coming together and holding its affairs in public. And maybe we can just go. Yeah.
Yeah, so particularly around the topic of Sproul, and how has it been used around conversation of free speech or demonstrations in general, because it has been forever, and was up until this Free Speech Week. Students still protest and demonstrate about all sorts of important issues. And I think one thing that students are trying to grapple with is, how does politics and national limelight and those kind of power roles influence what doesn't get heard and what doesn't get protected by the university as much. So I can think of some other demonstrations that were organized on campus on Sproul when it wasn't high profile, and because they didn't fit with time and place and manner rules, were very easily dismissed and removed from that site from police. But sometimes during this week, students get the feeling like the people that came to speak got a police escort. And so I think it's interesting how, or deserves conversation on how, whose speech is being weighted and heard to and given more value. And I don't know what the solution is to it, but there is an inequity in how that space is used and who gets to occupy it and who listens.
I think in looking at these spaces, what's really interesting is this history of occupying, right? Using, creating Sproul Plaza and recreating it as a public square. Right, and that's really what it's been. You know, the GA, I'm the president of the Graduate Assembly here at UC Berkeley. came into existence because of the free speech movement. It was graduate students who led it. You know, Mario Salvio was creating this space where we saw very starkly demonstrated that there were many people, right, and filling that space, they were able to show that there was a plurality, at the very least, of individuals who did not feel like this space, this university, was for them anymore, and were demanding that a space be created. And I think when we look at these different protests, whether it's Occupy, Black Lives Matter, or this, actually no, not this most recent, and I think it's an important distinction to make around this most recent, there's been demands for the creation of spaces, most often physical, or a specific change, right? There's been a call for the catalyzation of spaces to become new. The graduate students were actually kicked out of the ASUC, which is, you know, supposed to be the student government for all on this campus, because of this demand to transform the university. They were disenfranchised from the right to vote on things in this campus. And the reason that they were here and they were agitating was tied to things like the civil rights movement, the fact that we were using student fees to pay for segregated spaces, such as the fraternities and sororities, which at the time were still segregated. And so in transforming those spaces and really calling for inclusion for more, it was something where these spaces were themselves looked at as transformative. The reason that I differ this most recent free speech movement is that there hasn't been that same call for a thing. There has not been the same end point that's been as clear. There's been a lot of agitation, and I think the agitation is very clearly linked to a pain, clearly linked to a feeling of being silenced, but has it actually been moving towards something? And that for me has been really challenging, because when we know what we're moving towards, when we know what this transformation is that we're being asked to collectively create together, then we can have some sort of solution. There can be catharsis. There can be something where we can call to an end, but there hasn't been that same ask. And so I wonder, and part of what I've been doing with the chancellor actually has been saying, well, what sort of space can be created for students who hold conservative values? Because they are here, they demand to be listened to, maybe not actually creating space for discourse, but they're here and they're demanding that space. So how can we provide them with what it is that they so clearly need and want, even if they're not able to articulate it for themselves? And so I think that for me is really important when we talk about space. What is it? Is it actual physical space? Is it this digital space? Is it this communal space, which is again different from your places point? But how do we get there? Because without creating a space where we're all coming in, all we're doing is talking past each other. And there's no actual reason for Sproul Plaza to even come into play with this, because it can't actually serve its purpose, which is to be a space to create something new.
Well, let's see. The Berklee suffers from both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is it's the famous, shouldn't use notorious, that's a pejorative word, can be. It's the home of the free speech movement, and you know, Berklee has this reputation going back decades, right? And the curse is that the rest of the world is watching, right? What's the old slogan from Chicago in '68? The whole world is watching. I was thinking for a while that a year or two ago, I sort of watched some of these campus controversies, a little bit of a bemusement, because one of the things I was thinking is, at least it's not as bad as it was in the '60s, when you didn't just have the National Guard on Kent State, but 4 students were shot dead and classes were canceled, right? It wasn't just the interruption getting of exams, or nobody's mentioned today the People's Park protest here in 1969, right? Which featured the only, I think still the only air raid ever called by the National Guard on protesters here. Much worse than what we've seen here. Or Cornell University in '69, where people occupied administration buildings holding loaded shotguns. Students, not the police, right? And I know they're both passed away now. I know 2 professors who resigned and left because of the death threats they've got. When people are making death, Professor Reich talked about death threats he's gotten. When people are making death threats who actually have loaded weapons, you tend to take it seriously. That's what things were like 40 years ago. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, it's upsetting to see what's been happening here lately. But for a while, I was comforting myself saying, at least things aren't as bad as they were then. Well, in the last year, I've started to say, boy, things look like they're taking a bad turn. And so I wonder if some of the other, I think in particular of, the altercation at Middlebury College when Charles Murray went to speak, where Professor Stanger was given a concussion by a mob that wanted to do violence to Charles Murray. Charles Murray spoke on this campus 3 years ago. No fuss. Ben Shapiro spoke on this campus 2 years ago. The university spent zero for security because there was no fuss about it. Why is this happening now? I think actually it is Trump has made everybody lose their minds. On the right, too. It's divided the right, I think, right? So, sorry, I'm rambling a bit. Sproul Plaza became the campus equivalent, the American equivalent of Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. Professor Reich, I think, referenced that this morning. Anybody ever been to there on a Sunday when it's, yeah, you've been there, right? It's insane. You have really crazy people talking. By the way, as an artistic matter, they're really good, some of them. They're just really great orators, but sometimes you have Nazis or pretend Nazis. It's never clear if they're serious or not. They're trying to get a rise out of the crowd. And the police are there, not out in a big force like here. There's just a couple of the just to make sure that a fight doesn't start. There'll be 8 people speaking at once, and as I say, it's mostly crazy stuff. Now, Sproul Plaza is not crazy, but it is sort of this wide open space now where anything kind of goes, and as was I think could have been driven home more in the previous panel, part of the free speech movement starts is because there had been restrictions on political activity in Sproul Plaza, and we swept all that away. I don't know if it's possible to go back to any restrictions that somehow make sense of, how do we stop things from spinning out of control that present, actual threats to people and populations on campus or disorder, or that constitute a real distraction to students who want to go to class. I kind of like the wide opens. I just love walking through the place and seeing all the tables every day. I don't know if we can go back to that. We're going to talk about the legal aspects of, I guess, the next panel. But that's a little bit of a ramble. So I don't know. I'm sort of worried about things, but hoping that we sort of stop now and reach some kind of equilibrium and don't see more of what we saw a year ago, February.
So the relationship between space and place, like when I got called in and Ken and I were, talking about what did it mean to introduce a camera that could be remotely controlled and kind of bring anybody who wanted to into the place, but without actually letting anybody else know they were there. I think it signaled that campus was thinking seriously, not just about the space, but about the place, right? That what were the kinds of activities that place was designed to support, and what was the infrastructure, the space that was necessarily to make those things flourish. And I think because the infrastructure today that is influencing the flow of information is not centralized. It's not a campus investment, right? It's in my pocket, it's social media, that it means like there's less discourse about what it means to bring that in. And I'm sure as, blogging, it's gonna make me sound really old, and I am really old, but when blogging became popular, you'd be in an academic conference and people would be like, there's no blogging, right? Or all of a sudden, every time I go someplace, they're like, this is Chatham House rules. And I'm like, how can it be Chatham House rules? Or but this sense that if people didn't try to assert some collective expectation about the place, that the technology in people's pocket was going to mean that everything, like people were going to be held accountable for any misstatement they made, or things were going to be taken out of context or whatever. And so people were kind of trying to reassert some social expectations and norms to protect the kinds of places that they thought were important to support certain kinds of dialogue and discourse and risk-taking, right? So I'm a professor, and I do not make my students share all of their work on social media, and I don't even make them do peer review on everything, because some of the stuff, it's between them and me, or the conversation that happens in the classroom. Sure, people are going to talk about it, but I'm not streaming it anywhere, right? That it's important for the kinds of discourse that we want to facilitate. And so I think that, you know, that conversation that we were able to have about should we put a camera up here reflected the important ways in which technology changes place. And today, because technology is at everyone's fingertips, we're having a hard time. And like, you can look at the Antifa and the fact that they're all, right, covering up faces, etc. And you could say, well, that's about the fact that they want to be violent, but you can also look at the fact that there is a risk to being identified, and there's been a huge rise in desires for obfuscation, right? And even people who are engaged in completely expressive activity, nothing violent, may still be concerned that other people are going to dox them or to, right? And so I think that we're having a difficulty trying to figure out how to create places that support specific activities, because they require a certain level of community collaboration, and that the decentralization of the technology can make that difficult. And I, unlike my colleague here, I don't want to turn off social media. But I do understand the way in which it can complicate some of the affordances of places.
So I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor in a minute, but I think that one of the points that I really appreciated that's come up in all of the speakers today is this notion of the disruptive effects of technology on spatial expectations, on expectations of spaces of discourse. And the architectural historian Sanford Quinter states, somewhat tendentiously, that the first piece of modern architecture was the handheld megaphone. Not a Bauhaus piece of architecture, but the amplified megaphone versus just the trumpet, which allowed effects of speech to be suddenly and unexpectedly amplified against normal, all the norms and expectations of speech to that time. Suddenly, one person could speak to very many people, and many people have talked about, for example, Nazi Germany's mastery of the technology of the loudspeaker as a way to create spaces and situations and crowds that followed. I think today, again, as an architect, but also someone who thinks deeply about civil society, it occurs to me all the time that our society in the last 20 years has made a series of bargains with itself, spatial bargains fundamentally, but that are masked by the mediation of technology. So just as a dumb example, one would never agree to a free cleaning service for one's home 20 years ago if the cleaner could rifle through all your bills and filing cabinets and leave targeted pamphlets around the periphery of one's living spaces. It would be considered a gross invasion of privacy and a bargain that we would never want to make. And yet we somehow felt completely comfortable making those kinds of bargains for a service like Gmail. So, dumb, extreme example, but what it shows is that we have already made a series of different expectations in spaces which seem to us different, or seemed to us at the time to be different, and therefore had different expectations. But one of the very fundamental qualities of social media and contemporary technologies is that spaces can unexpectedly and unpredictably be connected in ways that sometimes reflect inequality of those spaces and sometimes reflect an amplification. And so I really, really appreciate your slides, Jillian, because the way in which we saw in that cut into this scene, the way in which a very small incident was being deliberately and profoundly amplified spatially and in a mediated way. And that's I think underlying a lot of these questions about speech and civil discourse is the way in which we have no common space. The space is always connected to other spaces, but asymmetrically, space is only open or privileged to a certain number of people, and that this is a profound architectural conundrum that's also, of course, a civic and political conundrum as well. And with that, I will open it up to see if anyone has any questions from the floor, or if you guys also have questions for each other.
I guess I wanted to ask a question about safe spaces and trigger warnings. So
We are connecting this talk to
Yeah.
a virtual space for which the
sorry.
microphones are necessary.
Well, now I'll have to change what I was about to say. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I wanted to ask about safe spaces and trigger warnings. I feel like a lot of the time, like whenever college campuses are brought up, especially in relation to free speech, this like largely dominates the discussion or takes up at least a significant portion of the discussion. But you know, I'm at Berklee, which I think is what's considered one of the more left-leaning college institutions in the country, and I'm in two majors, which are I think two of the more lefty majors that I could take at Berklee. And I've had a single trigger warning, and it was about like a really graphic image of like a rape from a painting, which it seemed pretty reasonable. And I've never like been forced to confront to a safe space. Like I'm sure I could like seek one out if I felt the need to, but it's never been something that like somebody's told me to like, oh, you can't say that in this particular space, or like shut down a discussion that I've seen somebody having because of a safe space. And I've like had a drunk Trump supporter come to a class about colonialism where the professor was a Marxist and like just yell at people like a few days before the election, and like that wasn't even shut down. And so like I guess I'm just wondering like why it is that this dominates so much of the discussion about colleges and free speech when it seems to be such a small part of the experience, at least from my perspective.
Thoughts on that question?
I mean, it reminds me a lot of the things that get blown up outside of our space here. I mean, looking at this photo, or when I was looking through online, I literally just Googled UC Berkeley Free Speech Week police. And so many of the photos are sensationalized when we were literally walking to class because this was our norm. So I think the conversation around why do safe spaces on that discourse take up a lot of space in conversations around campuses. I don't know. I was just gonna say is that I think in practice it's a lot more about community agreements, in that even when they're not defined, like in a classroom, there's a community agreement of what a classroom is for, and there's expectations of how a professor will conduct a classroom, and there's an expectation of open dialogue. And similar when we're talking about how do we create safe spaces, a lot of what I do in the ASUC when we have difficult discussions is, these are expectations of how we communicate with each other. This is what we're looking for to come from this. Like, we give each other grace. And so I think in practice, it happens a lot more naturally than this notion of that we're these fragile snowflakes, and it's this, bubbled wall environment that we have to live in, I think is just blown out of proportion through the media.
Elitism, right? 1/3 of people in this country even come into what we call higher education. There's a lot of people who don't know what this is. It's an unknown. It smacks of those who feel like they might be superior. And those who think that they're superior, well, then what is it that we see that separates them from us? And how can we then maybe attack it, right? This is something that is often uniquely ascribed to these sorts of spaces, right? And so it's something that you can pick up and hold up and say, this is really weird. I don't understand this. This might be wrong, and thus it's something that I will take umbrage with. I think we do see that there are, most universities, as Professor Hayward's been talking about, have become liberal spaces, right? And so again, this is something where we see some things that are distinct from what we might call the rest of America. But I think it's also important to look at recent research that shows that a large plurality of white people who will say that they're against white supremacy actually hold white supremacist views, in some cases even majorities. And so what is actually happening in these spaces? Are we actually providing trigger warnings? Are we actually providing safe spaces? Or are we actually fostering communication? And even when we're having that communication, what is actually being believed and actually being held as true? And so, in the GA, as we haven't been live streaming any of our meetings just because we are a very small outfit compared to ASUC. But when we talked about live streaming, it suddenly became this huge issue of inviting people in. All of our meetings are public, but now we're putting it somewhere else. Now people are being seen. And so how is that shifting what might be perceived as a safe space to challenge things, to say things? We're actually a much more conservative group than the ASUC is, in part because of just who we are, right? Graduate students tend to be a bit more conservative. We tend to be a bit older. A lot of us are in law or business, which tend to have kind of that slight different bent, moving a little bit more towards the center. And so when we talk about the snowflake or the safe space or the trigger warning, I think it's just something where people might not understand it because they might not have ever come into spaces where that has been something that's even been provided to them to talk about why it's important, right? I've never had to worry about how I'm talking to someone else because everyone else is like me. And that is, again, part of what this idea is behind these trigger warnings, these content warnings, and these safe spaces, is that we're saying you have a lived experience that could prove really challenging for you to continue to be in this space. But if these people are never even afforded the opportunity to come into the space in the first place, then that's even more alien.
About that really quickly. I've learned so much about language and how to communicate things, specific concepts, in a new way that's very exclusive to coming to Berklee, and that comes with a lot of privilege. But think of content warnings. When you go watch a movie, there's a rating. You grow up knowing about what books are meant for different ages. We have mechanisms for us to let each other know what they're about to engage with and have that autonomy. I think that it's a part of liberal elitism that I think there's a valid critique around creating these, you can throw words around like systemic racism and institutionalized injustices or safe spaces or content. And I think that it can close off that dialogue when in reality we want to make sure that people know what they're getting into, can engage equitably on a same playing field, and can leave that experience not being harmed. And these are all just common values I think we all have, but the way that we discuss them can put them in boxes and be easy to be pointed at and used to ridicule others that hold those values very dear.
I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I would make 2 points very quickly on that, on this. First of all, I think we have to recognize that the flow of information in spheres of social media will give the maximum accelerant to something that informs and reaffirms the preconceptions of a particular group of people who are seeking out small nuggets of information that do that. And so the out-of-context discussion of things like trigger warnings and safe space do that, just as small out-of-context pieces of information about any group will reinforce prejudices and preconceptions. I think one of the enormous difficulties of the university, one of the reasons why I will always have a very difficult time criticizing those in positions of leadership, even when I disagree with their actions, is that the university as a space for knowledge and discourse attempts fundamentally to do the impossible, which is to institutionalize and bureaucratize norms and standards of behavior around knowledge and the sharing of information. And so there's an enormous, when we bureaucratize manners, right, which we have to, when we bureaucratize standards about sexual power in the workplace, which we have to, we're basically saying we have to bring a very difficult institutional, necessarily somewhat brutal institutional structure to things which are normally traditionally handled in a much more easy way or a much more subtle way between people and situations. And so I'm not saying that we don't need to do that. I'm just saying it is an inherently brutal mechanism. In the same way also that institutions can then sometimes unintentionally, but often quite deliberately, also institutionalize other forms of subtlety like racism and privilege.
Yeah, I'll just
catch a plane, and we need to go to the next panel. I'll give Stephen the last word.
Okay, well, just real quick. So, yeah, I think one of the problems here is that things are out of proportion a little bit, and I'm usually trying to tell my conservative friends, yeah, of course universities are liberal. They've been liberal for decades. This is not news, but it's more complicated than that, and you can learn a lot from a good liberal professor. I guess objection is too strong a word. I don't think the safe space idea can be extended to the whole campus. So what I think we need is social structures more than physical structures, especially at a big university. That's really hard to do because we've never really broken free of the don't fold, spindle, and mutilate of your punch card that Ms. Stack referenced in her talk earlier. Trigger warnings, one of the reasons these things have been sort of taken on a legend, maybe stories at Fox News or wherever, is some student will complain about something where people say, wait a minute, maybe, but that offended somebody? It catches you by surprise. I practice trigger warnings myself, but I don't use the term. Just give you a quick example. I will tell students in advance that we're going to read some difficult and potentially offensive material. I'll say our reading for the next class is going to be the 7th and final debate between Lincoln and Douglas in Peoria in October of 1858, and you're going to see some language that today we would find deeply offensive. I don't want to boulderize it, because if you do that, you disentangle the larger dynamic that's going on between them that I think is relevant for today. I give them that kind of warning. I'll just say, and I totally understand if you find it offensive and want to stop reading or whatever. That's how I do it, but I don't use the term.
Okay. It's a much longer conversation, but we're going to end it there, and I'm going to give this